Fantastic. All right, so here we are on this gorgeous day, James. I hope you appreciate the weather.
I do.
And so let's just start by you just introducing yourself, a little bit about your background and how you came to be here today.
My name is James Leonard, and I am an artist, and I live and work in Brooklyn, New York, but I'm back up here in the greater Boston area with my current artwork, The Tent of Casually Observed Phenologies, which is for lack of a perfect term, it's what I think people would call a performance installation. And this is a piece that was begun back in February of this year, 2015, when I was an artist in residence at the Boston Center for the Arts for 4 months as part of their program of trying to encourage and foster the emergence of new artworks that are socially engaged artworks.
My original inspiration for this whole PredictionX course now was so that the public would really understand what's behind climate change simulations and that they would take seriously the work that's being done and that they would think about their future much more reflectively and that they wouldn't kind of dismiss these predictions as uncertain when they hear the word uncertainty. And then what resonated so much with me about your work and your project is that you are also, I think, right, trying to get the public to think more about the future and divination traditions and climate change. And I'm just curious if you can tell us again a little bit more about how the creation of the tent and the research that you did for this project relates to the climate change issue.
The research for me has really been a process of discovery. And I'm coming at this very much as an artist and a humanist, as opposed to a scientist or an engineer, and saying, "Aha, I'm very clear. I have a clear path." And I may be actually giving scientists, like, putting them too much on the peg, saying that you guys must know what you're after when you start, because maybe you guys begin with questions too. Maybe that's why it's called research overall. And for me, the first question that, as well, I was working on another piece of media that was, or another performance piece where I was shaving a boat away into a sea of shavings. And this was in part a response to the Arctic melt of 2012, which was it's the largest on record that we've ever experienced. And trying to relate to my own sort of visceral emotions about that sense of the impermanence that showed, the massive scale of change. And it came to me sort of as a dreamlike image, this guy shaving a boat out from underneath himself. And so while I was working on that, I was realizing that I was working a lot in my relationship to the past and the present. And somewhere along the way I was thinking about the future. And I think it started as a very cynical and naive moment where I said, well, if we're not going to listen to climate scientists, we might as well be listening to fortune tellers. Uh-huh. And at that point, I had a very, very different relationship to divination than I do now. Fast forward a couple of years, and I've spent a lot of time actually working with diviners of a number of different traditions, doing artworks about impermanence, doing artworks about my relationship to try to understand divination. And this side journey has taken me into territory where I'm now rethinking a lot of my own original assumptions about divination as something that I know I held what feels to me sometimes in vernacular conversation with friends and colleagues seems to be sort of a stereotype of, well, divination is proto-science. It's science that isn't quite right yet. And when you actually get computers to tell you the answer and run simulations for you, you don't need it anymore. Or when you have an accurate scientific theory, you don't need it anymore. And instead, I've started seeing it as a cultural practice. Having now experienced it both as a diviner, I'm giving readings inside of the tent about climate change, and experiencing numerous readings myself, receiving readings.
And that was part of your research process.
That was part of my research process, very much, to try out starting with the storefront fortune tellers and then going into more traditional religious and cultural spaces that took a long time to get into. They're fairly closed communities. A reading is made up of several things, several components. There's the diviner and the querent, which is the person who does the reading and the person who asks the question. And the reading itself begins usually with a question or a concern, something that has been brought. And then there's often a tool in between that will be your method of divination. Sometimes that's an internal method. In some cases, like the people who are members of the spiritualist church will conduct seances, and so their method of divination is happening from visions and things happening within their
Yeah, we
head.
talk about that a lot in the course, about all the different kinds of processes that people use, and that some people use random processes in nature, some people take the more human, spiritual approach, and some people use some kind of official randomizing influence, like a tarot deck or
like a tarot deck or
or
the I Ching, like flipping
Exactly.
quarters to do the I Ching, or casting the yarrow
So
sticks.
did you try all of those?
I haven't tried all of them, and there's several hundred existing different methods of divination, some of which have been sort of lost to history, but there are echoes of them, there's lore of them, and I found that that's sort of a side interest that I've developed, is just sort of the flavor. There's something about it that very quickly, as I was just even exploring, like, say, the Wikipedia entry on all the methods of divination, it's so long, and half the time it reads like something from the 1960s conceptual performance art.
Really?
That for me, like, really, moved me, like divination by dripping wax, divination by the tracks of beetles, divination by laughter. But the thing that all of these divinatory experiences that I've had, when they function well, have had in common is that they create a space that does a couple of things. It creates a space that opens up the mind for decision making. It's not a substitute for free will. That's one of the first mistakes that I think a lot of modern people who are unexperienced in divination come
by that you
to it
mean
with.
that it's not a way to see a preordained future.
It's also not a way to get a yes or no answer.
Right, and what I've experienced by being in your tent and talking with you is that there really is this aspect of getting people to think about their alternatives and about possible futures and about what they know about their own future. And you were telling me earlier that part of the role of the diviner is to get the querent to really talk and think openly, and to be in a space where they can really kind of have this experience where they're focused on their own future, and where they sort of can see the world around them, but not really. And I think that the space that you made definitely accomplishes that.
And this leads us to what the other main function that I've seen in any of the successful divinatory experiences that I've had is, which is we're all taking in so much information. By the time you're 35, 40, 50 years old, you have decades of life experience. If you're an active participant in the information age, you've read hundreds of thousands of words. You've experienced maybe hundreds of academic theses and takes on something if you're an expert in your field. And how do you put all those thoughts in order? But what ends up happening, and I believe we've used this term before, that divination can function almost like as a comb for all of those thoughts, all that information that you've taken in. It's a way to sort of, if you think about the way a comb can move through hair and lay it into line and give it shape, it's a way to take these hundreds of thousands of different ideas and start finding the natural shape within it.
There's a story that David Carrasco, who's an expert on Mesoamerican cultures, told us. I don't know whether we had heard this story already when I met you the first time, but he talks about the gods being annoyed with the humans, that the humans on Earth were learning too much about the future and about the world, and that they took a sort of a philosophical mirror, and that they breathed on the mirror to kind of fog up the view that the humans have, but that nature around the humans still has all these hints about the future and what's going on, and that a lot of the divinatory practices in Mesoamerica have a lot to do with nature and natural phenomena, and the idea is that they're trying to see past this fog. And it's the same kind of thing you're talking about the periphery, about that there's information there that people just don't normally access in their everyday lives, and they're sort of trying to find a way to access that information. And you might think that I, as a scientist, wouldn't want to think about the world that way, but I think that there are a lot of different ways to think about the world. And what you've taught me, really, in talking to you, is that, just like you said, that we were talking about climate change a minute ago, and you said, that you thought, well, we might as well just listen to fortune tellers. And when I started working on this course, I think that I was probably pretty biased against this kind of, just sort of human reflection, and what can you learn about the future from human reflection. And I've really come to see that, I don't think you can predict the climate 100 years from now by human reflection, but I think you can get people to think about their future and think
Right.
about choices. And so I'm curious, just to come back for a minute to climate change, how has the reaction been to this tent, and how do you feel you're doing in getting people to think about the future and their own futures with respect to the climate also?
Well, just 2 days ago, we were exhibiting the piece in the south end of Boston, and I was just finishing up a reading, and I overheard somebody outside who was. We have a little sign that sits out in front of the piece that lets people know sort of the general house rules. Sort of please be respectful if we're engaged,
Right.
and this is what we're doing, and this is what the piece is called. So it sort of helps put people in the right state and have some instruction for how to approach it. And there was somebody who just sort of out loud said, why would I talk to a diviner about climate change?
Okay.
And then somebody else said, well, why don't you go ask him and find out?
All right, that's a
the
perfect
reading
way
was
to put the
ending.
question.
The short of it is this gentleman walked away not fully convinced that tarot doesn't work, but instead that it made him look at everything that he's already taken in himself about climate change. Some of the grim prophecies, some of the hopeful stuff, some of the stuff that says, don't look at it, ignore it. And juggle it just differently in his head for the afternoon, and it got him thinking about it, and he even remarked that, sort of as he left, that while this is a great tool, whether he's going to use tarot or not, but like just even this way of like looking at this problem, to start digesting it, because I think that's one of the things that I find why I want to make art about the problem, is it's so huge, it's so overwhelming. I don't even know about my fellow man. Just for myself, how do I bite this off?
I know people who will be part of the course later, who do the climate change simulations and who do climate policy research and all of this, and they also feel overwhelmed. And I actually think that that what you're doing is a very important complement to making people sort of take the perspective and look at the context of all of the different kinds of predictions about climate, most of which are not good if we don't do anything, but that giving them a sense that there are choices and that they can think about the choices, and that maybe they can even learn something about the choices from these, somewhat time-tested or ancient techniques. From talking to a lot of people about climate change, have you gotten a sense of whether people respond better to maybe a positive message or a negative message, and how thinking more personally about it makes a difference?
I think it's actually the fact that divination is a personalized story. Since you are the querent and you are starting the story off with a question, there's an instant level of investment there, and it's tailored to you, and I think that engages people differently. That personalizes it. And sometimes people are actually just even looking for affirmation, but they don't want just a pat on the shoulder. They want some sort of external medium, and this comes around to one more third major benefit that I've experienced myself.
Benefit of divination.
Divination as a cultural practice, whether it's connected to a spiritual practice or not, is how it helps us in a non-pharmaceutical way deal with chronic anxiety, like chronic reality-based anxiety. And there are times where I find myself saying loss is going to happen, but it doesn't need to be absolute loss. That even in and of itself helps people make some sense.
Because people think about what that means.
And it helps sort of either step down expectations or get people more on a realistic plane that, okay, it can't be business as usual anymore, but where do we go?
It's been absolutely fantastic, and you've opened the eyes of a scientist.